Ministry of Future Affairs is a series of peer-to-peer interviews organized by Armenia 2041 Foundation and conducted by well-known Armenians and non-Armenians from around the world. The series covers a wide range of topics, including science, education, healthcare, politics, business, and focuses on themes relevant to Armenia and the diaspora. Watch every week on Armenia 2041 and CivilNet platforms.
So welcome everyone. The Ministry of Future Affairs program consists of a series of peer-to-peer interviews to gather perspectives from around the globe on science, business, economics, culture, education, healthcare, so that we can share all that with the global Armenian nation. It's an initiative that we've launched recently to help bring awareness to various topics and enable sustainable and secure development of Armenia as a country and Armenians as a global nation. It's my pleasure today to be talking to Ardem Patapoutian, who is a Lebanese-born Armenian American. He's a professor in the Doris Neuroscience Center at Scripps Research and a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator. He's a Nobel laureate and received this recognition for his work in physiology and medicine for groundbreaking research that solved a long-standing mystery of how the body senses touch and other mechanical stimuli. Welcome, Ardem. Let's start out going back to your birthplace, Beirut, Lebanon, something that we share. You're born there, you attended Armenian schools before enrolling at the American University of Beirut and subsequently transferred to the US, and I've been living here since. Can you tell us how your upbringing as an Armenian in Beirut and later as an immigrant in the US has impacted your career choices and your worldview?
Being Armenian and growing up in Lebanon, both Armenian community and Lebanese highly value education. And I really experienced that as a child growing up. My parents, my mom was actually a teacher and a principal of a Armenian school. It was an AGBU school actually, and so education was very important. And I remember my mom spending long hours with me in the afternoons, making sure I was learning properly and doing all my homework, something I have not done with my own son. But I think that had a huge impact on me. And coming here after 1 year of American University of Beirut and enrolling at UCLA, I remember being shocked that it was not very difficult for me. It was not a very big jump. So, it means that my education was in firm ground. So that was a very important aspect. I got into doing science totally by accident. So I don't know how much being an immigrant or Armenian impacted that. But I can say now that I'm in it and I've practiced it, I think having this immigrant mentality of looking at things from a very different culture that we're from, so looking at science with a very different point of view is really, really important. There's a lot of scientists studying the same questions, and if you come from a different field, you look at it differently. You look at it with a fresh eye. And I think there's parallels to why immigrants have done so well in the United States, who come here with that different perspective. And we talk about diversity as well, as if that's kind of something to be given away to allow. I think it's beneficial to any field of study, and especially science, to have people that come from very different backgrounds, who think differently, who approach questions differently. And I think my immigrant background has had a huge impact on it.
You hinted at an unusual way by which you came about science. Maybe you can share with us how you got interested in science, and importantly, when you realized that you would be a career scientist.
So the one thing that was lacking in Lebanon was tradition of training scientists and practicing scientists. So I didn't know any scientists there. I didn't know that was a career that one could pursue. So when I came to UCLA, I was a pre-med student trying to go to medical school, obviously. And I quickly realized that, at UCLA, class sizes are somewhere from 100 to 400 students per class. So it was very hard to get to know professors and to get letters of recommendations, which are so important to get into medical school. And then I had the brilliant idea that, oh, why don't I work in a lab just so that I can know a professor and they can write me a good letter. So it was a completely self-serving, for a different purpose kind of thing that I tried to get into a lab, which was not easy at that time. There was no email, kind of placing ourselves with age here, but and I remember calling 20 professors, and none of them wanted to deal with an undergraduate who had no experience in a laboratory. Finally, the last person, who was also Judy Laniel, was going to say no. Just before hanging up, asked me, "What was your GPA again?" Uh, so it was good, but not perfect. It was 3.7, I think. And she's like, "Why don't you come talk to me tomorrow?" And that was the beginning, because once I start working in a lab, I just realized how much I absolutely love the discovery process of all this, how our bodies work that we just don't understand. And you come into lab with ideas and test it. Um, so it was wonderful, and I immediately fell in love with it. And it took me a few months, but realized that this is what I should be doing, and kind of shifted approach and went to the PhD route instead of going to medical school.
And there's a common kind of commonality in the way many people do science, and a kind of a scientific mindset and an approach. How did you, or when did you pick that up? Was it purely while you were doing experiments, or did you at some point start kind of thinking through how science should be done, could be done, and then begin to incorporate it?
I think it slowly kind of processed it while being in science. I think, unlike any other profession that I know, that education, like in a classroom, that's how it starts. I always feel like the work of a scientist in a laboratory, there's no manual of how to become a scientist. So you kind of have to put in the hours and slowly learn and look at examples of how things work, try to make generalizations, learn from it, and move on. One of the ways
Hmm.
we exchange ideas, every laboratory, science, biology laboratory does this at group meetings. And when you go to a college for a course, there are requirements. You take biology 101, and then you take more advanced biology. Here, you kind of are thrown in, where postdocs and graduate students who've had 5 to 10 years of experience in how science is done talk about the work. And so initially, you don't understand anything. You hardly know what's going on or why they're doing what. And I think it's this ability to try to pick up small lessons and getting generalizations from them is a key fact. But some people don't like this because they don't feel comfortable with uncertainty of not knowing. I think
Hmm.
that's one thing about me that I don't have any problems with saying I don't understand this at all, or but
Hmm.
that doesn't scare me or take me away from it. On the
Hmm.
contrary, whatever interests you, you dive in and try to learn. But there's no textbook of
Yeah.
how to become a scientist. As I said, it's a process that you have to be patient with.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, what you just described also fits the immigrant mindset, because immigrants usually arrive and they're not supposed to know something, and so they have an easier time asking than if you're supposed to be born with that type of endowed knowledge that now you have to admit isn't perfect. So that's a good connection. So
Absolutely.
let's talk about that a little bit more. Most Armenians, and for that matter, probably most people in the world, learned about you and your work with the announcement of the Nobel Prize, for which we all congratulate you. But if you look back at the work that you did, that you feel earned you that recognition, just to get the audience to understand the long term nature of this, but also the spikes in advance that happen. Was there ever an aha moment where you kind of realized that you had made a discovery of such consequence and such importance?
Yeah, I think back about this now, and of course, it was never the goal to win a Nobel Prize. I don't think scientists, um, at least they shouldn't do the work for any prizes, but for the process of discovery. I mean, we knew we were looking for something that was very important in the sense that it was a major unknown that was a lot of people were curious about for decades, but hadn't been able to crack it in a ways. And so we knew that it was an important question we're asking. That there's no doubt about it. And the experiment that we did, the initial experiment with my postdoctoral fellow from France, again, very international flavor, Bertrand Coste, was we used a very reductionist approach to ask these questions. We thought a lot about how to do this. And once we decided how we're going to approach it, Bertrand had to work on this experimentally in the laboratory for a whole year. We didn't know how long it was going to take to find this one molecule that we were looking for. And so one has to imagine what it is for him and for me trying to support him and work with him, a whole year of not getting any positive results. So you make a decision, this is how we're going to work. And then for a whole year, you just get negative result day after day. And you have to stay motivated to keep asking the same question you were asking. And finally, at the end of that year, he got a result that clearly showed that he had found what he was looking for. So that's as close as an aha moment as I can imagine one would have. And so we were very, very excited. But as in many things in science, that aha moment was important, but it took years and years afterwards, more and more research to appreciate how important the discovery was. So it was partly clear from that moment, but it took years to kind of solidify that thinking that this was something important.
Ardem, in your description, you mentioned that nobody does this kind of science to win awards and recognitions and the like. But obviously you are in a field where people do get recognized, very, very rarely, especially with such magnitude of recognition. I'm sure you've been asked this question 100 times, but for the 101st time to an Armenian audience, how did it feel when you got the news?
It's a roller coaster. I mean, the first thing people have to realize is that it happens if you live in the West Coast 2:20 in the morning, so you're not very coherent. And in my case, I actually had my phone on do not disturb, so I did not get 3 phone calls from Stockholm that morning. Interestingly, they got a hold of my father, Sarkis, who lives in Los Angeles area. He is 95 years old almost, and but he answered the phone. The head of the committee actually told me that my dad was not very happy to be. So someone was calling him at 2 a.m. So he was kind of yelling at him a little bit. But then finally, I think he understood what was going on, and he called me, which he could overcome the do not disturb message. And then when I checked my phone with the missed calls, I realized what was going on. But you have very little time to kind of think about what this means or what's going to happen, because you get immediately inundated by so many media calls and a press conference.
Yeah.
And you got to realize that unlike many people, we go from just being in a lab, not really used to this kind of attention. It's all of a sudden it's 2 a.m, so you don't have too much time to process. And I hadn't talked to that many media people, so it's a shock to the system. But as the days and the weeks and the months go by, you start realizing what an incredible privilege it is to get such recognition. And I've said this before, is one of the greatest joys is to see other people rejoice in it. And so I have to say the whole Armenian nation, the kind of response I've gotten it is one of the highlights, because how they've embraced this as their own is causes me great joy.
Well, it's funny, you described a little bit ago how you and your French postdoc, spent a year discovering a protein, and in a similar way, the world discovered your work. So if the protein had feeling, maybe it would have felt like it won a Nobel Prize. by being discovered at the same moment, because that's how the protein became known too, is through your work. So
Yes.
that's great. Let me just kind of stick, especially now that you mentioned your father, to that theme, and I kind of expand a bit. On April 24th, you tweeted that you were thinking of your ancestors who perished and those who survived and started a new life in Lebanon. What does being a descendant of Armenian genocide survivors mean to you? What kind of responsibility does that legacy entail? How does it affect your life?
It's a very complicated topic, a very important one, obviously. And I don't know of any Armenian who the genocide doesn't play a huge part of their being, because we grow up Armenians born in Lebanon already from the get-go. You know that that's direct consequence of the genocide. And I think Armenians are so passionate about this for a good reason. I went through different phases in my life. I was very dedicated to this cause, and it was a big part of my life. And then for a while, I kind of took a step back, because I didn't want this to define me or our nation. Right? I just didn't want the genocide to be the thing about Armenians. I think I wanted us to move on and do other great things, and be known for those kind of things. Um, at the same time now, especially after the recognition, I kind of hinted at it. Being an immigrant, being an Armenian is part of my story, and I certainly, again, embrace it. And most importantly is how we learn from this, how we go forward. What do we do with this information? One of the things of being a scientist is, we mentioned my postdoc was French. I have this image that I show in my seminars, putting a pin on all the birthplaces of every member of my lab was born in. And if I showed that to you, they would be from all over the world. And so science is the ultimate, I think, example of people from around the world can come together to do good. And this humanistic kind of internationalism, I really embrace as well. I love to think of
Hmm.
myself as human first. And that's not anti-nationalism, but it kind of puts it in perspective. So I so again, I told you it's going to be a complicated answer. I feel very passionate about being Armenian. I'm very proud of being Armenian. I think it's a tragedy how we still discuss today about the genocide not even being accepted by everyone, and we need to learn from it. At the same time, I feel like you can have a healthy dose of nationalism at the same time. Feel like we're all humans and we should all work together for, as the Nobel Committee says, for the better of humanity.
Hmm. That's great. That's excellent. Also, speaking of your father, I know that he composes poems. He's an accomplished writer. What do you like to do other than working on science, that kind of enriches your life beyond the science? What other
I
interests do you have?
Yes, absolutely. I love the arts as well. I don't write like my father does, but I play a little bit of trumpet. But I love music of all kinds, jazz, classical, rock. So I attend lots of cultural events. I also love the outdoors. That's my number one passion, I would say. Whether it's hiking, backpacking, swimming in the ocean here in La Jolla. Not only because I really, really enjoy it, I've often said that while being outdoors is when my best ideas in science come to me. And so I know the question was not about science, but I feel like my life is very connected. It's I can't separate them actually very much. Um, but yeah, I love to travel, which being a scientist is a wonderful way to travel a lot, especially with this recognition. I have lots of invitations from very interesting places in the world. Um, so yeah, I think that being a scientist, especially later, um, you don't have to be in the laboratory 18 hours a day to to make the discoveries. It's mainly about thinking the right way, and you can think while doing anything else. That's the best part about it.
Super. So I'm gonna try to pry from you another kind of a simple question, but maybe with a complicated or difficult answer. Um, so there's going to be a lot of young folks who listen to this, and you're an inspiration to young and old, but particularly those who are thinking about a career trajectory. And I'm sure some of them are wondering, as I would have, as you would have, if you listened to this, how it is that you decide what to work on. So obviously, you were drawn to a particular set of problems, but you've made decisions of what to work on next, what interests you. How do you do that?
I would say that's the best part about doing basic science, because you have that complete freedom. You wake up one day and say, how fibrosis in liver happens is not known. I'm going to study that. And you can. That's the beauty of science, is that you have to find what interests you, what is an open question that you can tackle, and you can study it. Of course, you got to find funding. There are details we don't need to talk about. But so to me, how I make the decision is it always starts with observation. I don't think it's an intellectual process first, observing what we understand and what we don't understand, and then deciding which of these questions have a practical probability to solve it in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's kind of that intersection between what is unknown and what's doable. So let's say if I said I want to understand how consciousness works, that's a wonderful question, one of the most important things for human in neuroscience. But do we have practically the tools in a laboratory to be able to answer that in the next 5 to 10 years? And if the answer is no, maybe one needs to find a different question. So the process for me is, again, very simple. But what I want to mainly emphasize is what I said first, which is this amazement I have of how does our body work, and the answers that we don't know to it, and that we can do experiments to find out, is the most amazing pleasure one can get out of it. And that's what I love doing science.
Yeah. And a related question, and I'll keep my questions limited now because I want to make sure we get through the whole list. But I mean, it's hard to work in biology or fundamental biology without facing the kind of underlying process that created all this complexity, which is evolution, Darwinian evolution. How have you interacted with the concept of evolution in your scientific life? And I mean by that, in all the difficult, like when you look at what do we know, what we don't know, a lot of what we don't know because it's really hard to figure out what evolution has produced. How important is that in your work?
I think evolution is a lens that we need to use for all questions related to biology, because unlike computer chips where you can design something and build it, everything that we experience and see around us has gone through evolution this whole millennia. And I'll just give you an example. The protein that we talked about, that we identified, called piezo, are these mechanosensors. They sit in a outside of the cell lipid membrane, and that sense membrane tension. So one of the things that is very unique about them is they're one of the largest of this class of proteins called ion channels. And if you look through evolution, this same protein is very, very large, from unicellular organisms all the way to humans. And so the first thing you ask yourself is, why is it so large? I get this question all the time. And I always answer it from evolutionary perspective, because it takes a lot of energy to make a very large protein. If this large size was not required, evolution would have had time and reason to cut it down and have a smaller version that works just as well. The fact that it's not tells me that it's part of its importance. So here's a question then you can start answering from the lens of observing it through the eyes of evolution.
Now, in addition to being a scientist and many other things, you're also a teacher, and you've trained a lot of PhDs and postdocs over time. Are there two or three special insights that you like to impart to your trainees, in addition to exposing them to some of the deep questions in biology? What are they?
I say this often now is that I'm painting a very rosy picture of science, which I believe it is, but it also can be very frustrating. And I think this applies not just to scientists, probably everyone in any profession. We already talked about Bertrand spending a whole year not getting any positive result. You can imagine how frustrating it is. I hinted at this but didn't talk about it. Securing funding to do your research can be a very frustrating process. And so many scientists experience this. And what I see in trainees a lot of times is this frustrations, although they're very real, taking over their kind of day-to-day existence. So the whole thing becomes a frustrating experience. And I like to just remind people the joy of doing science, of why they got into it to begin with, which is again what we talked about, is you come in every day to lab thinking of a new question that you ask, and maybe some days you'll get an answer that no one else ever knew in the history of humankind. I mean, that's a very special thing. So I think focusing on positives, being an optimist, and reminding you of why you got into this line of work in the first place are great ways to keep the frustrations at bay and focus again on what really matters, which is doing science. You love it, that's why you did it. And again, I think this is not just for science, but many people in different careers experience the same emotions.
And I want to kind of conclude by taking a kind of an imaginary flight to our homeland in Armenia, for that matter, the diaspora in the Middle East, and Armenians in general. And obviously, you now have a life of experiences and exposure to lots of different mindsets and ways of living, and what represents kind of Western mindsets, but also other Eastern mindsets. If you integrate all that and you look at where we are in our development as a nation, what kind of hopes and dreams do you have for the Armenian nation? I mean, we're obviously at a moment where our safety and security is somewhat challenged. There's serious economic challenges. It's frustrating on that front. The question is, in your mind, as you increasingly kind of are seeing the world, in a different perspective, what kind of ideas, top of mind thoughts do you have that could be useful for your compatriots to hear?
Obviously, we know that Armenians throughout history have been very talented, very hardworking, and I think this is something to be very proud of and also to cultivate. So both you and I are, huge supporters of education, and I think, looking at Armenia or any other developing or developed country, I would say the same thing about United States is encouraging education is one of the most important ways for solving many of the problems that the world and also Armenia faces. So education, I would say is the highest priority as far as I'm concerned. And I'm happy to do anything I can to get that message across. And when one comes more into individual decisions, if I look back in my career, I feel like it's just so important for me to have found a career that I'm good at, but at the same time, I love to do and have a passion for. I often said this too, that if I was financially well off and nobody paid me, I would still do what I'm doing now. What a privilege to be able to say that. And I think if everybody, and I believe that everybody has a passion like this, it might not be science, and to strive for that is one of the best ways you can not just give yourself a content, happy life, but help your community the most. Because if you're working on something with a passion, chances are you're going to help your community much more than if you look at job as something you have to do and you're unhappy with. And so my advice to kids is explore. And I look at my past and see how I stumbled into this laboratory research without knowing that I would love it so much. And I guess the key to that is try to experience as many things as you can while you're doing your education, and again, find your passion.
Yeah, super. No, I think it's a great takeaway, and I'll just add to that the desire to be the best you can be at something, but also the best in the world if the opportunity is given, and not settle for good enough. I mean, that's what you've done through your career, and I think there's many examples, and I think those examples can also remind kind of all of our nation that there's really no reason to assume that that's not possible for us, but it's possible for some other people. At the end of the day, in any chosen field, it's the hard work, it's the accepting frustration and disappointment all along the way, and a lot of fortunate breaks along the way, and really aspiring to greatness in every single activity. So listen, it's great to chat. Thanks for doing this interview, and look forward to meeting in person soon.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ardem.